Hi, Sam.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. Nice to be here.
Good to have you. Thanks for taking the time. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Samuel Moyn. You are both a professor at Yale Law School and a professor in the history department at Yale. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're the author of a number of books, including Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World from Harvard University Press. That's the most recent?
It is.
Very recent, right? Last year.
Yeah. That about a year ago now.
And how are you liking the tsunami of fame that always accompanies the publication of a book?
Well, it's always excellent to get engagement, and I like criticism. So there have been lots of positive and negative reviews, and hopefully stirred a discussion. And if I turn out to be wrong, I think the discussion is worthwhile.
So you're not a postmodernist. You do think there's such thing as wrong. You could be wrong.
It's possible. Remote possibility.
Okay. Admirable humility. Well, I think we'll have a chance to get into some of the themes that are covered in the book. We're going to start out talking about the search for a new progressive foreign policy. And I think Bernie Sanders, having announced his candidacy this week, offers a good vehicle for discussing that. I think it's your view and the view of some other people that Donald Trump has either created a new opening for conversation about foreign policy that's maybe broader than the traditional foreign policy conversation that was permissible, or if he hasn't created it, he at least signifies that such a thing is possible. And so it's a good time to have a conversation about foreign policy. I've had a few of these. We spoke with Heather Hurlburt last week about this same thing. What should a progressive foreign policy be? So let's start out by talking about Bernie. Do you have I think the standard view is he didn't have a fleshed out foreign policy view when he ran for president last time, but he has since unveiled something more like one. Is that your view?
I think that's true. I mean, relative to the other, prospective Democratic nominees, he's far out front, in part because he's run before. But he's still, like I think the rest of us in the early days of imagining exactly what a progressive foreign policy ought to look like. Like most people, he's much surer about the mistakes we've made, in war and peace. And so those seem relatively easier to call out. He speaks for economic issues first and foremost, for our fellow citizens in the United States, and what the program would look like, about the global setting for and the kind of global economic relations he wants to see to make possible his domestic program. I think he's at the very beginning of thinking about.
Yeah, I haven't looked as closely as I should have into exactly what he said. His foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss, who was the cover story of The Nation last week,
right,
I've known for a while, and I would vote for Bernie just on the basis of that. I mean, I would much rather see Matt running things than what we've had. The main theme I've heard associated with Bernie's foreign policy is anti-authoritarianism, which like he's against authoritarian governments, and I need to hear more, because neocons say the same thing. They, of course, do not apply that standard consistently.
No.
On the other hand, the average president, upon getting into the White House, finds that consistency is hard to come by with any of these things. So I need to know more about exactly how what Bernie's approach is there. I'm almost a little surprised by the emphasis, precisely because it's kind of neoconish and doesn't seem to me to speak to the most urgent problem of how do we quit. What seems to me the most urgent problem is how exactly do you quit doing these apparently counterproductive and disastrous military interventions? And what is the criterion for intervention? if not the one that's
right. I think that's all fair. I mean, you're right that, democracy promotion, it sounds good and noble in theory, but in practice it's been owned and operated by neoconservatives, and it's so strongly associated with them, and it's led to ruin in so many places, not just Iraq, that we'd need to hear more from Bernie or anyone else about exactly what it means to speak up for democracy. I think he's right to think that's an important imperative for a future foreign policy, because the risk is to come off as let's say isolationist or engaged in just pure withdrawal from the world. But certainly as a first step, as both the last two presidents have said when they ran as anti-war candidates, not engaging in stupid wars is like an absolute threshold, criterion of any future foreign policy. And it's at least good that Bernie has been on board with that principle for a long time.
Right. But as you say, recent history suggests it's easier to say than to do.
Sure. Well, that's, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, I think, won in part as anti-war candidates and governed as wartime presidents. And it'd be interesting to think about what exactly Trump is doing in testing the foreign policy establishment by withdrawing from Afghanistan and Syria. But it's clear he's, no dove. So I think he has shown that you can try to avoid what Ben Rhodes, Obama's foreign policy consigliere, called the blob.
Right.
And you can,
the foreign policy establishment, in other words, liberal interventionists, neocons, it's all one blob that keeps doing the same things. That's
right. And so I think we started out by saying Trump has been at least disruptive, and he's faced lots of pushback with this withdrawal that he's tried to conduct. That's revealing. But I think that the exciting thing is that the options on the table, and it's getting more and more support on left and right, that we can let the blob roll on and go our own way. Yeah,
I want to talk about what opportunity Trump does and doesn't signify. Before we get to that, there's one criterion for intervention I've been encouraging people to think seriously about with limited success. It's just that if an intervention is not clearly in compliance with international law, don't do it. You wouldn't have invaded Iraq. You wouldn't have, in my mind, done Kosovo. You wouldn't have let the Libyan intervention become a regime change operation. And I don't know exactly which drone strikes might and might not comply. If any of them were curtailed, that would, in my view, probably be progress when you look at their long-term consequences. But why? I mean, you're not hearing people say that, right? In progressive circles, no. Are you hearing people? Why not? Isn't that the most obvious thing for a progressive to say?
I think it's a really good starting point, because as you say, we have a much better record of obeying the international law that applies to how you fight than the law that covers when you can initiate or continue hostilities.
Right.
Now, international law is not perfect, but you're absolutely correct that those who have challenged it have tended to be the interventionists who think it's too confining and constraining. Now, I think we may need to go further than international law, because international law allows lots of intervention, not least when there's foreign state consent. And much of the drones we've sent out and the special forces we've used in the last year they operated in 150 countries, which is 3/4 of them.
Wait, say that again. I want to make sure I got that.
Well, so we shouldn't fixate on drones, which are surely significant, but the new form of war that I think George W. Bush invented and Obama perfected, and I think Trump with these withdrawals is kind of taking to its kind of logical conclusion is no heavy footprint engagement, but no footprint engagement from the air with drones and other kinds of missiles, and light footprint engagement with special forces teams. And the uses of those teams has shot up really to an extraordinary level in the late Obama and the Trump years. And as I mentioned last year, there was a light footprint of at least one special forces team on the ground or passing through 3/4 of the countries on Earth.
That's amazing. Year. So it's not like violence has not been deployed in all those countries, but it's still amazing that we are militarily engaged. We were militarily engaged in 150 countries.
Correct. And then consider the global basing system, which goes back to the Cold War. So, all of that is legal because we as a dominant power, we can extract consent from almost anybody, depending on how sweet the deal is.
Or how severe the threat is to inflict some kind of economic punishment.
Absolutely. So, and then there's proxy war like in Yemen. So sadly, the rules of international law are a baseline, but it's not going to be enough if we're going to challenge militarism to say that whatever it allows ought to be allowed. But it's a good starting point.
Yeah, right. You would then go on to argue for discretion on the part of the president. A radical idea. But as a starting point, see, I think on the left, there's another source of skepticism about international law, which is like law in general, it favors the powerful. The UN was set up that way, and our domestic law favors the powerful and the rich, and international law.
Is true.
And to some extent, this will always be the case, yet I would rather live in a lawful United States than a lawless one, and I'd rather live, for starters, in a lawful world than a lawless one, and then try to improve, the equitability of the whole thing. But I just think this should become a talking point.
I agree with you. I mean, I wouldn't agree with your generalization just because it depends on what the content of the law is. I mean, if it's so bad that it's not worth obeying just because it's law, then we may want to argue for illegality.
In the case of international law,
but in international law, I think you're for Americans certainly, it all it can do is confine us, and so from my point of view, it is
a restrainer. International law is a restrainer.
Now we should remember that international law depends on who's interpreting it, and of course there are lots of liberal interventionists who will say, well, it's not international law that's the problem. It's the restrictive interpretations of it. So, they'll argue that Kosovo, while it was said to be illegal but legitimate at the time, ought to have been seen as legal, or that Iraq wasn't illegal, or that Libya wasn't illegal, especially since there was an authorizing Security Council resolution. I agree with your interpretations, but once you let the lawyers out and say you're adhering to the law, you have this interpretive debate about what it requires and forbids.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the people you're talking about are the people who will be banished after the revolution. So,
okay, then it's less.
But also, I mean, some of these cases are clear cut. I mean, you're right. Like when they start arguing legitimate but not lawful, well, they've lost. I said lawful. That's what we're talking about. And people were saying that before Iraq. Look, that was a plainly illegal thing, and it was the most disastrous of them all.
Agreed.
And I just said, and again, the criterion should be if it is not clearly in compliance with international law, I think that anyway. I
Sure,
think that should be.
I agree with you, but I just want to report this rueful fact that the president has, men and women now who will find whatever he wants to do to be in compliance with international law.
Yeah.
So,
international law is in a state of evolution, such that there's more amorphousness there.
Yes.
But I also think it's in America's interest to further the evolution. It just seems to me like if you are a power that is certain to be in relative terms a declining power, assuming that's assuming things work out well, right? Because that's assuming the rest of the world does develop economically, which is in our interest. Then we inevitably will have less relative wealth, ultimately less relative power. If you want to prepare for that kind of world, you don't want it to be a jungle, right?
I agree with you. I think you're totally right, and yet we can't separate that threshold claim from the struggle over changing the content of international law. So it's still very permissive. Maybe we'd want to argue that there are some situations in which humanitarian interventions ought to be legal, and we ought to, define those so it's not just up to the United States to decide when. The biggie is international economic law. So if we're upset about neoliberalism as Bernie and maybe some other Democratic candidates are, well, national inequality in the United States and so many other places is galloping because of neoliberal globalization, and that's a legally organized thing. And so international law is as much the problem as the solution.
Okay, before we get to that, and we will get back to Trump, I promise, because I did promise, but I want to say one thing about humanitarian intervention, which you kind of touched on, which is that, it's a concern of mine. Tell me if you think my reading of this is right. I was saying to Heather Hurlbert last time that I think if you look at the way the UN was structured and its emphasis in terms of international security, its original emphasis, it was kind of a realist institution. And she took that to mean, they let the powerful countries have all the power. That wasn't actually what I meant. That's true. But what I meant was the emphasis was on preventing transborder aggression, war between nations, and a fair amount of sovereignty was granted to nations. The idea wasn't we're going to go around cleaning up the human rights situation in the world. The idea was you can do what you want within your borders, but do not attack another country. Now, it seems to me it'd be a great accomplishment if you actually succeeded in that endeavor. And it seems to me the trade-off they accepted, which was to grant autonomy to do even horrible things within, pretty horrible. Not super horrible, not like genocide, but to have an authoritarian regime, for example, so long as you didn't transgress boundaries. That was a not crazy trade-off to accept. And one thing that's happened now is there is a growing movement, the phrase right to protect and so on, R2P, signifies a movement in international law to, I think, authorize more in the way of humanitarian interventions. And I think that carries a risk of authorizing the kind of interventions that certain people in Washington want for actually reasons other than humanitarian ones. Iraq being a perfect example, actually. So I'm wondering what you think about this whole issue, the current balance of emphasis between these two goals, preventing war and encouraging human rights within countries, and how that might play out.
Your reading is right on. The United Nations was founded for the sake of peace, not justice, and especially for the sake of interstate peace rather than intrastate justice. It was hoped that, there would be humanitarian causes, but humanitarian intervention was about the furthest thing from the minds of those who founded the UN, because they'd lived through a history in which any authority for war they understood as a pretext for abuse. And they really wanted to just strike items off the list of reasons you could use, transborder force. And so they left these two biggies. One is great power agreement through the UN Security Council, and the other is self-defense. And actually, since we should never forget that the United Nations was also an inter-imperial peace, which kind of shockingly allowed for decolonization in the couple of decades that followed.
So by inter-imperial, you mean what exactly?
Well, there were 50 odd states in 1945, and it certainly wasn't the idea of the West European empires, notably France and the United Kingdom, or for that matter, the United States, to decolonize the world through the United Nations.
Right.
In fact, FDR had thought before being convinced into founding the UN that there would just be these regional hegemons. And it would be like explicitly, inter-imperial or balance of power. And the Russians, the Soviets would get their zone and so forth. And in effect, that's what happened. But what's interesting is that once they got statehood, the post-colonial states said even more fervently that there should be no pretext for war, because they knew that the whole history of empire was built on humanitarian intervention. Notably claims that slavery needed to be extinguished the world over, which was in fact a recipe for, globalizing empire. So what happened is, since the 70s, we've kind of taken a second look at that bargain. And I think you're right that we've put a lot of energy into opening up an option for justice that wasn't there in 1945. It would be different if we knew how to make it work. But these humanitarian interventions almost unfailingly make things worse. And so we shouldn't explore that kind of righting the balance between peace and justice until we actually think that war will improve justice in the target states. And so I'm fully with you. And I think, Democrats today have really soured on the, military humanism of the 1990s and 2000s, in which it was thought that the United States could, use its military to, promote global justice.
So you're ambivalent about R2P and...
R2P, it was like the successor concept to humanitarian intervention, an attempt to rebrand it and maybe figure out a way of hoping to reform target states before military action became necessary. And in fairness, those who devised R2P really insisted that any military action be restricted to what the Security Council has approved. But I think, as we've seen in Libya, and as the Russians and the Chinese learned as a result of Libya, even that permission slip for limited and humanitarian action, in fact, could be a pretext for regime change. And even if it's not, it still could make things much worse, which in fact happened in Libya. I mean, that's, Barack Obama has said his worst mistake was allowing Hillary Clinton and Samantha Power to convince him to topple Muammar Gaddafi, because in fact the United States has created an almost ungoverned space which is much worse than what prevailed before.
So, and to review, for people who don't remember, so the initial mandate from the UN Security Council, and under international law, kind of any intervention authorized by the Security Council, in which the U.S. has a veto, along with 4 other great powers. But anything authorized is lawful. By definition, what was authorized is an intervention to protect some endangered civilians in one town, and then that morphed in a way some people claim was permitted under some language in the resolution, but anyway, morphed into a regime change operation. The initial part would be the so-called R2P part, right? The right to protect. And that means that the international community has a right to step in and protect. Is that's
no. So the rhetoric that the commission that invented this concept of responsibility to protect involved is that
responsibility. Okay, I'm sorry. Exactly.
So it first and foremost, states exist for the sake of human rights.
Right. And their leaders have the responsibility.
That's right. That's right.
If they fail to fulfill it, then intervention may be warranted.
Exactly. There are 3 pillars, and military intervention for the sake of human rights is kind of only is supposed to kick in when the prior 2 pillars have fallen. And the first is, the sovereign himself is responsible, and sovereignty is responsibility to people. And then there could be non-coercive measures, non-military measures, if the sovereign is no longer responsible, and then and only then. Now, that all sounded good, but in the end, it didn't stave off, the problem it was meant to solve, which was humanitarian intervention, which unfailingly makes things worse. So does R2P.
Yeah.
So far.
So, you wanted to talk about kind of issues of, I gather, global economic justice and how now it's interesting that you say the neoliberal economic order internationally, I think you're saying, has made things, did you say it has exacerbated inequality within nations?
Yes.
Because I think there's one view that's kind of contrary to, right? There's a very common thing you hear, and I think there's some evidence of this, that like, okay, so the neoliberal agenda has expanded trade. That has actually brought a lot of people out of poverty in China, in India. So there it's been kind of good at the national level and has reduced economic inequality. Workers in America, though, have paid a price for that because they've been, the low-wage labor abroad has deprived them of jobs. So I think a standard way of thinking about this is economic inequality has been exacerbated in the United States, but in some countries, it's actually been reduced and poverty has been reduced and so on. So it's kind of a trade-off between kinds of inequalities. And in fact, they would say at a global level, I think these, in this reckoning, inequality has been reduced. Now, is there something wrong with that view?
There's a kernel of truth in it, but it's largely wrong. But it requires us to disentangle, 2 things that are so often, confused with each other, namely poverty and inequality. So it's absolutely true that essentially China has remediated, like no other agent in world history, so-called extreme poverty, which is what the World Bank defines as $1 and change per person a day. And they've brought more than 700 million individuals from below that threshold to above it. So it's exciting, but let's not get too excited in the sense that they've made those 700 million people poor rather than extremely poor. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time,
I mean, if you're one of those people, that is a meaningful difference, probably.
Right? Well, it is meaningful, but it sort of depends. If you double my income from 50 to 100,000, we know what that means in an American city. We'd have to look at what does it mean to increase your income from $1 to $2 in a peasant community in China. Probably a lot, and surely it's a good thing. But the point is that by itself, it depends on the importance of this line of extreme poverty And we'd also have to look up what's happening to the poor. Are they getting richer too? But the main thing is that that's gone along with the greatest and most rapid expansion of inequality in any country across the same time period. So we have to understand that making people less poor is not making society more equal. In fact,
China
it's gone along with making society less equal. And in fact, this relationship has prevailed in many countries where the poor are getting better, but the rich are the real victors.
So if you look at the Gini coefficient, a standard index of inequality, that has grown in China?
Skyrocketed over the period of marketization. Same in India, although they've just seen less poverty remediation. But they're in the developing world, they've seen inequality go up, kind of, just trailing China in how rapid it's been. So it's only fair to say, alongside the poverty remediation, been some equalization at the global level, because there is some middle class work. And you're totally right that the people paying for it are the northern, ex-industrial workers who are stagnating. So, I mean, overall, that may be, a defensible set of outcomes, but we have to ask first, could we do better with poverty? Does it require the expansion of inequality in so many places? Even if we decide it does, and we decide that northern workers ought to be degraded, to improve global equality. If they ditch democracy along the way, then it seems like we made a mistake. But the main thing to say is that, in response to the apologetics you kind of started with, is that it's all a rationalization for the victory of the global rich. And it doesn't seem like there's any reason I know of why we have to excuse that choice as if it's necessary or fair, just to northern workers in a country like the United States, but really to the rest of our global humanity.
I assume the reply would be, what's the alternative? Do you have a plan that lifts all these people out of extreme poverty and maybe lifts them a little further, and or at least beefs up the true middle class and does less in the way of enriching the super rich? Do you have a plan?
I do. It's called the welfare state. So
except it's international.
Well, so there were people in the late 20th century before neoliberalism came who said, what we need to do, since welfare worked at the national level, is begin to experiment with scaling it up. And instead what got scaled up is economic liberty. But I mean, you're right that we need detailed policies, and they would need to be shown to work better than the alternative on offer. But we know at the national level that it's quite possible to improve the situation of the poor, create vast new middle classes, and restrain the rich for the sake of a more equal society, because that's what was done across the global north. And certainly the equality part of it has been abandoned, especially in this country and a number of others. Although retained in other parts of Western Europe.
Do you have in mind a specific policy? I mean, so you're talking about global governance. This has to be a version of global governance to get the job done, which suggests you've got an uphill challenge, because it seems challenging enough to get people to do it's challenging enough to get Americans to use global governance to do things that are just plainly in the interest of America, let alone appealing to their conscience, So first of all, what's an example of a policy, leaving aside political feasibility? And then there's the political feasibility question, but let's start with a policy you'd favor.
So just to be clear, I mean, this is a very long-term proposition. Global governance isn't, an impossibility, because the neoliberals have captured it in the
Mm-hmm.
past 40 years, thanks in part to America's help at old institutions like the World Bank or new ones like the World Trade Organization.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as if there's no such thing that Americans will accept, because Americans helped build the thing as it exists now, and it's having all these effects.
Yeah.
But of course you're right. I would say certainly in the short and even medium term, for a party like the Democratic Party, the emphasis has to be on restraining inequality to help Northern workers, to give them a better deal than they've been getting. We want to do that in such a way it doesn't have a price for global poverty remediation and the very modest global equalization we've seen, but that's doable. In fact, it may even be necessary, because unlike in the era of the welfare state, states need to collude in taxing the rich. That's, they can do nothing. And certainly global governance will go nowhere if it's not funded by people who have organized global governance to allow them not to pay taxes anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a hard problem, I think. It's actually pretty easy.
What part is easy?
Forcing the rich to pay taxes somewhere, or to, through international law to the United Nations.
Yeah, well, there you have a separate but related problem of just the race to the bottom that ensues among nations in bidding for corporations. Unless nations get together and say we have to agree on some degree of harmonization of tax policy, or else companies are going to keep fleeing, to Ireland and then to Zimbabwe and who knows where, right?
Of course.
So
that's right. Well,
yeah,
those again, are always. Absolutely, those are real. Those are real political obstacles,
right?
But they're not hard to solve in terms of the policies you would pursue. You just have to generate the political will,
right?
Make a deal.
That may
the
be
same with climate change. I'm not pretending that any of this is politically easy, but it's not like unthinkable intellectually.
Let me give you an example and see. And I'm not actually sure how you'll feel about this. So I wrote a piece for Wired. It's in the actual physical magazine this month. It's with Elon Musk on the cover. Mysteriously, they put Elon Musk on the cover instead of me. Apparently, they don't know how to sell magazines. But leaving that
aside, wow.
So the argument was that Trump, in some ways, has set in motion some forces that could ultimately undermine support for Trumpism in a certain sense. And one thing I mentioned was that in one respect he's trying to steer. He may not understand this, but actually steer global governance to the left. The NAFTA that he negotiated had some interesting kind of innovations on the labor front. There's a requirement that for automobiles to qualify for free trade within NAFTA, a certain percentage of them has to have involved labor at $16 an hour, whatever. The point of that is it gives more protection to American workers than NAFTA had previously given. And interestingly, the left-wing Mexican government, I think, is on board with this because they think it will put pressure on Mexican factories to raise wages. So it's kind of like, it seems ironic. The Americans are hoping to price Mexican workers out of the market, but it's not so ironic, in terms of the Mexican government's support for it, when you think that lefty politicians support minimum wage, even though that might price a few people out of the market, but still it raised, that's kind of the logic in Mexico for this left-wing government supporting this. So I said, this is where, if you want to sustain support for global governance, which I think is critical for all kinds of reasons, and you want to reduce the amount of opposition to it that Trump represents, right? This is actually the kind of thing you need. You need to steer global governance to the left in ways that protect American workers. And in principle, the WTO could become a vehicle for protecting labor rights and doing things on the environmental front and so on. Now,
Correct.
Are you on board with all this?
Absolutely. That sounds right to me. I mean, it would have to work out that, in the end, these kinds of Trumpian versions of economic nationalism seem to consist in the end in the rearguard defense of dying industries, buying a couple more years
Sure.
Before they close. So there's, his purposes are short-sighted, but the larger, vision is one that the left has to match, and if only to preserve, liberal democracy and win Trump's voters. Now, you'd want to make sure that the way you do that doesn't come at, too much of a cost or even any cost. I mean, the real nut to crack, I think, for the left is thinking about how, in the midst of environmental crisis, to restore the kind of growth that can, lead to fairer bargains. And that's a tough one, because it really does require us to think beyond this rearguard defense of a manufacturing economy, and instead thinking about, who's going to be the vanguard in the information economy, and how do we get more Americans in it, rather than trying to, save their old way of life in the Midwest for them when the writing's on the wall.
Yeah. At the same time, what I think is interesting is that the logic behind global governance evolving to the left, the political logic for it in America, is sufficiently strong that Trump,
Correct.
who thinks he's still against global governance, and he says it every day, he hates global governance, perhaps without even comprehending it, just in following his own political incentives, has actually set an interesting precedent with NAFTA. There's an increment of movement, and in that sense, it's a strengthening of global governance.
I like that story, and it's definitely then a model for other things.
So why aren't we here? I mean, maybe we're hearing this from Bernie. I'm not sure we are yet. And I mean, it sounds kind of radical. I take that, but geez, it's no more radical than other stuff you're suddenly hearing from Democrats.
Well, I agree with you that we're waiting to hear from him something that, goes beyond a kind of, economic nationalism with some kind of liberal inflection or, non-racist overtones. He's been much better because it's much easier to think about war and peace and to talk about, a more responsible use of American power. But the thing he really needs to think about, and he needs to read Wired too, is how to transcend economic nationalism. So the headline would have to be some kind of, economic internationalism.
That's an interesting phrase. It may be more palatable than left-wing global governance.
Right.
Partly because, liberals love internationalism when they put the word liberal in front of it.
They do, but it also has its original connotations were socialists, which should suit Bernie just fine.
Maybe that's the ticket.
We need some kind of socialist internationalism that can match the neoliberal program that's gotten so ingrained.
I think just a phrase like the new internationalism, something that's like generically upbeat.
Absolutely. Part of this last book, which you mentioned at the start, covers what the post-colonial states tried to do in the 70s, and in following this famous Argentine economist named Raul Prebisch, they called it the New International Economic Order. And that was their brand. It just failed. Henry Kissinger destroyed it.
The word order is maybe slightly problematic for some people.
Well, let's say the new economic internationalism.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, I almost worry that some of the candidates on the left, you said Bernie's been focused more on war and peace and hasn't been thinking about this stuff. I almost worry there's also a tendency to think that, if you're a real lefty, if you're a socialist, the way to think about foreign relations is as fundamentally an economic thing And so you don't need to be clear about like when military intervention, like for example, I think Elizabeth Warren's foreign policy thing was very heavily kind of economic, and that's part of the picture. But I really want to hear clear ideas about how you revise our current military commitments and criteria.
Whatever they come up with will have to have two prongs: ending endless war and rethinking, economics for a different liberal or left internationalism. So these are the two. Now, these are connected in some way, but for policymakers and in the short term, they're independent, because one's about, whether and when you go to war, how you conduct it, how you think about, the justice, especially when there are despots and warlords. All of those I think we've made huge mistakes in that domain. Mm-hmm. And then there's this separate area, which I think has just gotten much less press. People like me who were young in the 1990s focused so heavily on atrocity abroad and its prevention, including through American arms, that we just missed that what was actually being institutionalized in the 90s and beyond was this neoliberal economics. And so we probably need to kind of restore the balance between, peace and economics, but never neglect either anymore.
Okay. Now, we promised to get back to the opportunity Trump may or may not represent. And I know you've talked about, and I listened to you, did a good, you had a good conversation with Jack Goldsmith on the Lawfare podcast, and you got into this a little, that Trump, kind of famously, he started saying things during the primary that you weren't supposed to say, certainly if you're a Republican, about foreign policy. Iraq was a mistake. John McCain is an idiot, all this crazy stuff. It didn't hurt him. Now, this was taken to mean, and I think maybe you take it this way, it's taken by some to mean, wow, there's a hunger for a whole new foreign policy vision. I took it to mean what some people have said all along. Most Americans don't care about foreign policy if Americans aren't coming home in body bags in large numbers, and the current mode of endless global war doesn't involve Americans coming home in large numbers in body bags. And so you can say pretty much all you want, but the fact is, when you get to Washington, you're going to encounter a reality that, precisely by virtue of the fact that most Americans don't care about foreign policy, the real power in foreign policy making is confined to a few powerful interest groups, and you're going to wind up being their slave. And I think to a large extent that has happened to Trump. He clearly, every once in a while, he tries to break out. I'm going to withdraw from Syria. I'm going to withdraw from Afghanistan. He gets the blowback. It becomes unclear whether he's going to succeed even at that. But to me, that's the compelling story, is that in the end, we are at the same place we always were. A few powerful interest groups control foreign policy, and nothing has changed. Is that wrong?
No, but there's some nobility in losing that I think we have to grant Donald Trump. Already Barack Obama, and his aides like Ben Rhodes testified to the power of Beltway assumptions that they couldn't beat, but they didn't stage much resistance.
Well, no, half of
Donald Trump has done so.
Can I just interject? If Barack Obama was really serious about beating the blob, hey, I've got an idea. How about you don't staff your entire foreign policy apparatus with members of the blob? How about that?
That's largely right. Although Ben Rhodes, was a 30-something, had no. But I agree with you.
Hillary Secretary of State, McFaul ambassador to Russia, and what's her name handling Ukraine? Give me a break.
Correct. I agree. Well, I completely agree. And of course, that's a broader story, because he also staffed his economics team with the same people who created all of the difficulties and actually doubled down on neoliberalism through the financial crisis. So there was a huge gap between talk and walk for Obama. And, again, I'm the least favorable person towards Trump, that I can imagine. But you sometimes have to grant that he's more boldly challenged the system. With respect to this emergency wall stuff, he's so routinely indicted for being post-truth, but in fact he was the first honest president who said, I'm abusing emergency law, declaring emergencies when there aren't any, which it's sort of refreshing when he just tells it like it is, even when what it is outrageous.
Well, I think Jack Goldsmith did a piece somewhere talking about how Trump embraces hypocrisy or something.
It's the reverse. That all the prior presidents were hypocrites.
He's so candid that he refuses to be hypocritical. He tells you actually what he's actually doing.
Correct. I that's right. And I think my response is, well, shouldn't there be more room for honesty and truth? I mean, especially when we spent so many years indicting post-truth politics.
Right.
Not to acknowledge that this is, one of the most truthful presidents that we've had in my lifetime. It's a thought to entertain.
Yeah. Although you have the same question as with Obama in the end. If you were serious about downscaling American military commitments, why would you make John Bolton your national security advisor and so on? I mean, Trump's even. I think Obama hadn't really thought much about foreign policy, and in a certain sense may not have totally understood the landscape. Yeah. Trump is even worse by a long shot.
I think the reality is Trump, is not a pacifist. He condemned in the campaign certain wars, but he's also upped the military budget long before he asked Bolton to join his administration, and he's really, let's say, heading towards something that I mentioned before has been kind of in the cards for a long time, which is this kind of light to no footprint war. But that means he's actually faithful to what Bush and Obama were doing. Right. It may be that there's petty disputes about how long to leave more troops various places and how many there ought to be. But it's not as if he's actually pursuing a politics of withdrawal. It's a withdrawal of heavy footprint war to replace it with light or no footprint war. But in the end, he's not all that threatening to the blob and not all that dangerous for mainstream assumptions. That's why
part of the reason is he doesn't mind killing people abroad at all. His objections to military intervention are two. One, he recognizes that if a bunch of Americans get killed, it's a political problem. And also, he doesn't like spending the money.
That's right.
Obama, I think, at least understood that maybe with all these drone strikes and so on, you're making the situation worse in the long run and breeding all this hatred of the U.S. But he was addicted to the short-term protection. He didn't want the attack to happen on his watch. Exactly.
I mean, in fairness, he just recognizes that certain forms of war didn't advance the goals they were said to be serving. And I'm not sure that he has a better option. But like Obama, he concluded that there are dumb wars that last forever, but don't change things for the better, and we just shouldn't fight them.
Mm-hmm. So I know you've got to go in 5 minutes. Is there anything else you want to say about your book? Maybe talk about that a little in the context of your book, Not Enough, in the context of all this.
The book is about all this stuff, but it's more narrowly about how we ought to think about human rights, which were central to the liberal internationalism that triumphed in the United States in the 1990s. And really were redefined human rights. Most people came to think of as being about preventing atrocity abroad. In blob circles, if you said human rights, what you were probably talking about is, crimes against humanity or genocidal acts that the United States should at least think about, preventing. Now, I tell a story in Not Enough, which looks at, let's say, the economic setting of human rights, and I try to show that human rights were born in connection with the United Nations as like a program for the welfare state. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there were economic and social rights, and the document wasn't about internationalizing rights protection so that powerful states could keep people alive. It was about saying that all states should provide welfare citizenship, which would involve getting people out of poverty, giving them houses and food and water and so forth, but also making more equal societies. However, human rights did change their meaning, especially for Americans, after Jimmy Carter introduced human rights policies for the first time in 1977. And they increasingly, they lost any economic meaning, and they became about foreigners or strangers, not about the welfare state, but about kind of minimal protections for the suffering abroad. Sometimes there were these economic and social rights that NGOs pursued, but not connected anymore to equality as an outcome, just trying to get people enough of the good things in life. And so my story is that we should have a human rights agenda, but you know, it's not enough. It needs to be connected to this larger rethinking of progressive internationalism that you and I have been talking about for the last hour.
Okay, sounds good. And are there any articles you've written recently that you'd want us to link to on the Blogging Head site?
Probably the best couple of pieces. One is in Dissent magazine called Beyond Liberal Internationalism, which I think I actually wrote when I thought Hillary Clinton was going to be president. And then I had to revise at the last minute once the verdict was clear. And then I have a more recent piece that's a critique of the famed liberal intellectual Michael Walzer, who has a book out called A Foreign Policy for the Left. And I sort of say he's not really facing these two major problems that have to be central: endless war and neoliberal economics.
In fact, I'm not sure he even opposed the Iraq War, but maybe he did.
He did.
He did.
But
okay.
but he's someone whose his main concern is even if in the end he opposes interventions, to kind of keep alive the possibility of such interventions, you know, and he was historically connected to interventionists. So it's you know, it's noble that he opposed the war, but he's been part of, I think, a mistaken way of thinking, which makes this death-defying question of when we bring out the heavy weaponry. It's been too much at the center of our foreign policy debates.
Okay. And what's your Twitter handle? Where do you tweet?
At Samuel Moyn.
That's Samuel Moyn. That's Moyn for podcast listeners. I tweet at Robert Writer, Wrighter. And as long as we're plugging things, I wrote a thing for The Nation about arguing, a very short piece of arguing that something called progressive realism could make sense as a progressive foreign policy vision. So we'll link to that too.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Sam. I hope we'll continue the conversation. This has been really interesting.
I'm grateful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Take care.